Hello and welcome to Project Merlin, where we're uncovering the darkest secrets in Britain's history. I'm investigative journalist Susie Boniface.
And I'm Dr. John Hogg, reader in 20th century history from the University of Liverpool. And today we're delving into the biggest ever declassification of nuclear records in a project run with the Centre for People's Justice that we co-designed with Lab Rats and Susie to facilitate a better understanding of and to catalogue the Merlin database. And we're doing this with a team of volunteer students. We'd like to say at this point that interpretations and opinions expressed on the podcast series will differ, and they're the personal views of each individual who appears, and they don't necessarily reflect the position of the University of Liverpool.
And with that caveat in place, today we're going to be introducing you to the people at the centre of the longest running scandal in Britain's history. That is the families of the nuclear veteran community who have been affected by decades of unanswered questions about their health following involvement in Britain's Cold War atomic weapons programme. Now, we're going to be talking in some detail about exactly what those health problems are and about that weapons programme. So last week, we were discussing how the project's being run and how it all came out of this thing called the Gledhill Memo, a document discussing long-denied blood tests on a squadron leader, which was the first evidence of British servicemen being used in radiation experiments, human radiation experiments at the Cold War weapons tests. That led in turn to the discovery and declassification of the Merlin database, which holds 28,000 files on the nuclear weapons tests and the men who served at them. So if we wanted to have an episode on every document, well, we could be here for some time. Now, this week, our guests are Alan Owen, the founder of Lab Rats, the main family campaign group, and Steve Purse, who's a prominent member of that group. Now, both of you are the sons of nuclear veterans. They served at different tests, and we'll get into your individual stories. But first, one of the things that we discussed in the last episode, and any of the listeners who haven't heard it, I suggest you go back and have a good old listen to the first episode that explains sort of how we got here. One of the things that really complicates and amplifies the trauma around this quest for answers, Alan, is because veterans like your dad are kind of no longer here. They're not, the next generation has sort of picked up this baton, and I suppose in a way that gives you a huge sense of responsibility when you come to sort of searching for the truth all these decades on.
Yes, it does. It does. We have to remember that a lot of the nuclear test veterans died young. There are lots of families who are without their parents. There are lots of families whose family members never got to see their grandparents, for instance, and will never see them. And we have to be respectful to this community. It's a multi-generational community that we're dealing with. And looking at the historic issues that have gone before us, we are just another group of campaigners who have, as you say, raised the baton and taken it on again after the nuclear veterans themselves in the 80s started the campaign. And we have to realise that now there is another generation following us. You know, the descendants are in their first generation descendants, 50s, 60s, and even we've got one in their 70s, who have campaigned now and are now going to be passing that baton again onto the next generation, who are still seeking the answers that their fathers and their grandfathers were seeking back when the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association was founded in the 1980s. A lot of those answers are still waiting for us as a group to uncover, and that's what the fantastic Merlin project is doing. But alongside of that, we have to be very, very respectful to the emotions that come with that. When you're looking through documents at tests where your father participated, for instance, it can raise lots of emotions. When you talk to veterans who were there when your father was there and says, oh, he was a great guy. Yeah, he was great on you, not just as a serviceman, but as a person, he was great. We had a great laugh. We had lots of drinks and those sorts of things as well. You get to feel them as a person as they were in their 20s, which you can't ask them that question now. I mean, my father died in 1994, a long, long time ago. and we can't ask him that question. He was only 51, so it's a long time ago, but it still raises emotions. And when you get to see, like I did 2 weeks ago, talking to a veteran who slept in the bunk next to him on the island, telling you stories about drinking and having a laugh and what they did, as well as experiencing those tests, it's great for me. But when you think about across 22,000 servicemen, then you take into the scientists, because we must remember them, and the Indigenous communities and everything else, and everybody else that's involved in the testing program. The community is huge and it's massive, and we must respect the communities, the different traditions, the Indigenous people as well. So it is a complex issue, and it's affected people in different ways.
I think we saw that we heard that in the first episode. Actually, we commented on the complexity of the Merlin database, and the global complex scale of this project and of nuclear test program history, really, and sort of talking about it as a set of fragments of a puzzle that we're slowly putting together as part of the Merlin project, but very much in the foreground. In fact, I went to see a screening of Our Planet, The People, My Blood last night in Liverpool, directed by Daniel Everett Locke, and Alan and Susie are both in that film. And Alan, it follows your story. A wonderful film, and again, really foregrounding the human centrality, the center of this story. And Alan, I suppose if I could ask you, was this something you were raised with? Did you hear about the nuclear tests much as you were growing up, or was it something you found out in the years that followed your father's death?
My dad didn't talk about it at all. My mother knew that he was at Christmas Island, obviously, but he didn't tell us as children until one day we were watching a program on the TV which showed what they all did then. They showed the explosion and the backs and then turning around. And he just said that was me. We were like, yeah, Dad's telling you war stories again in the Navy, it's those sort of. And he's like, no, I was there. And then when we researched it and got his service records out of the cupboard, and there he was, 1962 at Operation Dominic. And it wasn't until I met Doug Hearn, who was a big campaigner for the BNTBA, by chance, completely by chance, at a garden centre in Spalding, where he was raising money for the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association. And I took my very young son then to him, to the garden centre, and spoke to Doug and said, oh, my father was a nuclear test veteran. I don't know the real detail at the time. And he said to me, I really don't want to say this to you, but he's either ill or he's dead. And I said, yeah, unfortunately, he's dead. And that was it. We struck up a friendship that lasted a very long time until his passing. And then I got more involved. So it was later on in my life that we got to know more about his actual experiences and him witnessing 24 detonations in 78 days because of the program. And then talking to other families, and Doug introduced me to lots of people, and we ended up, researching a lot more and researching it as a family, got my sister involved. And my brother had died in 1996, very young, in his early 30s. And it was only 18 months after my brother died. So my sister also has problems. She was born blind in her left eye, and she has various cancers removed as well. That we started joining the dots with the rest of the families and talking to them. And that's why we set up Lab Rats. And I thought, because I was born 9 years later, in 1971, from when my father's participation was, that I'd escaped it because of the time difference. But unfortunately, 4 years ago, I suffered a cardiac arrest and was without a heartbeat for 8 minutes. And I'd got the curse for the heart problems that were running in our family, unfortunately. And it's for that reason that we keep going. That's why we set up Lab Rats, because the BNTBA was a great association, but focused very much on the British nuclear test veterans. We wanted an organisation that focused on everybody, not just at the British test, but across the world as well, and could bring people together with a bigger voice. Because I went to an American conference, and there were people there from French Polynesia, and they were there from the American tests, and talking to one particular veteran who was in the Nevada desert that was ordered to stand up and walk towards the explosion after being in a bunker, in a trench. They let the explosion go over his head and the blast go over his head, and then he had to get up and walk towards it. We realised that there was a massive community out there that needed to be brought together, and that's what we're trying to do with Lab Rats, is to give them a voice. The Indigenous people, especially, who have been left behind by various governments, the Gilbertese and the Aboriginals.
How does the complexity of all this? I mean, it's already an incredibly complex story, but when you think about the fact that you are finding out about this stuff in adult life, sometimes when your father has gone, you're looking back over your own lives and your family's lives and going, well, now that illness seems to be part of a pattern. Now this thing seems to be part of that. I know that your sister Laura has spoken previously. I don't think I'm breaking any confidences here. She's spoken previously in the Mirror about the miscarriages that she's had too. I know from speaking to lots of veterans' wives and daughters that when they have miscarriages, they don't really know if it's just, their hand that they got dealt, or whether there is some connection. And it's all that kind of piles up, doesn't it, into an extra kind of layer. I mean, it must give you a sense of, I suppose, a kind of sense of responsibility, or an extra weight, maybe, that you can't. It would be so difficult if it was my dad to be able to say, well, we're not getting very far, we don't know the answers, let's stop bothering with this. It would be so difficult if it was my own parent and he had passed to have to deal with that. I suppose if the veteran's still alive and isn't really interested, you can drop it and walk away. But it must be so much harder when you're kind of acting. What's the opposite of in loco parentis for your own father?
Yeah, it is. It's difficult, and when you talk to other families as well, you've got some that really want to take it on board, and others that don't want to engage with it at all. They feel that that was their service. I can't deal with it even, especially when there are children. And I know Steve will talk about it a bit later, but when you have children and you look at their conditions and you start to relate the conditions back up the chain, when you become a parent yourself, you realize what your father was looking at. Every time he looked at my sister, who was born blind in her left eye, did he think, was there a connection? Yeah. When my brother was ill with chest problems when he was a younger child, did they make that connection? Did he think, actually, was I exposed? Because we can't ask him that question now, that's always going to be in the know. There's never going to be the answer to that question. So we ask other veterans, do you think there's a connection? And a lot of them will say, well, not initially, but the more you talk to people, there's got to be a connection. There has to be. Yeah, the instances are too high, like you say, the miscarriages and the health problems and the issues. It's too high. There has to be a connection. And the biggest frustration for me is the denial, obviously, from the UK government being the only one still left to deny. And when you meet with them, the delay and the deny is the issue for us, because I know what my father would say as a Navy man: let's get on with it. Let's sit down, get around the table and get on with it. Yeah, if you've done wrong, admit it and move on. Let's get on with it and do with it. But they just seem to want to brush it away. And that's the frustrating part, is the time aspect. When you sit, like we lost another veteran on Sunday, and you just sit and watching them pass away without resolution. And I hesitate to use the word resolution, because obviously it was HMS Resolution on Christmas Island.
It was the name of the shore camp, wasn't it? The base at shore, that's the name they gave it.
That we've had no resolution, but there was a resolution on Christmas Island. And it's hard. It can be really hard sometimes to not go boom and explode at people, but to play the system and to carry on working for it.
Yeah. Well, and the Ministry of Defence would have its Jon. The Ministry of Defence would have its own thing that it would probably like to say here about health effects of nuclear weapons testing. And I think probably what we'll do is we'll get into that in some depth in a later episode, because there's a lot to unpick there with the science, the official science that's been done and the science that hasn't been done. And some of the science that hasn't been done is on the children and the genetic effects. Literally, the government has never funded any proper research into that. There is some peer-reviewed research indicating there are issues, but hasn't gone very far. But which probably moves us on to Steve and your own experience, because your dad was at Maralinga in South Australia, 4,000 miles away from Christmas Island in the ocean, and he was doing something entirely different there, wasn't he?
That's right. He was with the RAF. He was a flight lieutenant. His role was he was in charge of the airfield, but he was there during a particularly dangerous time. I mean, he was there later on in Maralinga's use. So there'd already been 7 nuclear weapons detonated there. And he was there for something called Operation Vixen, which is, they call them the safety trials, really. What they were trying to do was simulate what would happen if there was an accident to, say, an aircraft carrying plutonium or a nuclear warhead. My dad often used the phrase, they were just waiting to see what it would take to make it pop. And
so not a safety trial, just a really dangerous trial to see how dangerous the non-safe things were. Right, they called it a safety trial.
They're just taking loads of, nasty stuff like beryllium and plutonium and piling TNT over it, and then just blowing it sky high to see how far it would disperse. And guess what? It disperses a long way. So that was going on while he was there, and he talked about the safety measures, or I suppose the lack of safety measures. I mean, they were doing this incredibly dangerous stuff, but Dad always talked about he was able to walk anywhere he wanted and from the decontaminated area. So the sand doesn't obey a single wire strand fence, does it? It's laughable. He said the sand just blew in your hair, your face, your Land Rover, your bed, it was in your food, it was everywhere. He said we were just literally caked in the stuff. So that was Dad's experience, and then I guess he came home and thought that was that, but along comes me in 1973. It was obvious there was a problem with me when I was born, and they just took me away from Mum for days. He didn't know where I was or what was happening, and then they left it to Dad to break the news that I was quite severely disabled. And it turns out my main disability is short stature. There's about 200 forms of that in the world. And I believe that is quite almost a common thread amongst our cohorts. The illnesses are either incredibly rare or unheard of. And that's just one of my conditions. I've got several. And Dad never really spoke much about it, a bit like Alan's dad. The only thing he ever said was shortly after I was born, he just said to Mum, I think it's my fault. I think it's because of my time in Australia. And then that's it. He clammed up. And he only started talking about it later on in life when I used to work shifts, and occasionally I'd get 3 days off, and we would literally do what we'd call our little boys' trips, where we open the map of Britain and point at it and go, we've never been there, let's just go there and do that for a couple of days. And we talked in the car and, in the hotel while we were having dinner, and he started to open up. I mean, I always knew he'd been in Australia with a nuclear test. I always knew he'd been in Australia. I didn't know there were nuclear tests until later on. And he still never really told me much about the really dangerous stuff. He just said it was nuclear testing, but he talked more about the fun side of it. But I think behind it all, he carried a lot of guilt. And he certainly was afraid of the Official Secrets Act. I think that haunted him up to his dying day. And we lost him in 2015. But I think, for me, the worst part of it all, personally for me, is that they did that to my dad and they harmed him, which then harmed me. But then, it goes down the generations. And I've got 2 boys, one 5 years old and one 10 weeks old. And my 5-year-old already has been diagnosed with a genetic condition where his teeth crumble. And that was harrowing to watch, at the time he was about 2, but crying in pain when he ate because his teeth were literally just crumbling. And he's had 8 of them removed, which shouldn't shouldn't have. And apparently, this is also seen in the children of who were born and grew up around Chernobyl. So again, it comes back to this idea of, can you prove that it was the nuclear issues that caused these things? And you say, well, it's joining the dots. And as Alan was saying, you look at the numbers and you think there has to be a connection. So I guess when we talk about in locus parenti, I am doing all I can to get answers so that my boys have a better life or a better experience with the NHS than I did, because they do not know how to handle our cohorts. There's just no information out there, and that desperately needs to change, I think.
Well, thank you, Steve and Alan, for your honesty and your openness. It's moving and it's inspiring, and it's quite humbling to sit here and listen to your stories and the trauma, and the ongoing sort of nature of that. So I'd like to turn now then to the Merlin database, because I think part of what we're hoping is that in some way what we're finding in Merlin may start to answer some of these questions, may start to fill in the gaps of how much the government knew at the time, how much officials knew at the time, in terms of the amount of risk, the amount of hazard that was there for servicemen, for scientists, for engineers, for Indigenous people. And I think we're starting to glimpse a little bit of that. So in preparation for today, we asked you to have a little look at one source that we found. I think you found this one, didn't you, Susie? Was this something you found? Yeah.
Let me just explain briefly to the listener what it is, and then we'll go to Alan and Steve and talking about it. So this is a health physics report. Now, health and physics don't usually go together at all, but it was the phrase that covers sort of how they're looking at how radiation and the physics that is going on is affecting people's health. So it was the phrase they used to cover things like monitoring, background readings, checking various stuff, the doses they were recording for the men, the badges they were using to record those doses on. It was the overarching medical monitoring kind of thing was called health physics. And this is a report for 1 month, July 1962. Now we chose this because it's sort of smack bang in the period that affects both Alan's dad and Steve's. So Operation Vixen was underway at Maralinga, where they were doing hundreds of these safety trials, the minor trials as they were known as. Now there were maybe 45, I think, total nuclear weapon explosions, 24 of which were in Operation Dominic, the big joint US-UK test at Christmas Island. Just over 20 or so were ours, British ones alone, getting increasingly bigger. But at Maralinga and Emu Field, the weapons testing that was going on there was on components of the weapons. They weren't the big bangs, but they were lots of little bangs. And there was nearly 600 of those. And they were, as Steve said, exploding stuff, trying to see where it dispersed, testing the very central processes of the weapon to get the timings right, stuff like that. So that was what was going on at Maralinga. And meanwhile, at the same time, Christmas Island, the Americans were setting off a big load of H-bombs, which were the other end of the weapons program, the biggest, most powerful thing you can possibly detonate. And this is just a basic sort of a 14, 15-page report talking about the different contaminated areas, where they've checked them, where they've roped them off with that very safe bit of wire Steve was talking about, the monitoring they've done, air sampling they've done as well. So they had this thing where they would put sticky paper. If you imagine, it's literally a bit of sticky paper. They'd put it out somewhere on a pole, or at the top of a pole, or on top of a roof or something. They'd leave it out for a certain period of time and then take it off and count what's on top of the paper with radiation meters and so on, to figure out how much fallout is coming onto that particular area. And it would help you work out what's in the air, what's suspended, what you might be inhaling. It's that kind of mouth level, that sort of stuff. And they were doing all kinds of analysis for it. They were sampling the water. They were doing checking equipment and stuff like that. And that's basically what the report is. And it was astonishing to me because it mentions Operation Dominic. Now, Alan, that was something that I shared with you and Steve straight away, because I think it's something none of us realised, that Operation Dominic, 4,000 miles away in the middle of the Pacific, was apparently connected to Maralinga in South Australia. I mean, what did you think and see when you saw the document, Alan?
What amazed me was we've always had a timeline of different explosions, different testing. But this one was the first time where they are saying that the debris that they found in Maralinga is from Dominic, a test at Christmas Island. And if you look at the map, obviously, as you say, they're 4,000 miles away. So now, when I researched Operation Dominic, talking about safety procedures at Dominic and fallout, and everything was fine, there was no issues, there were no problems, and my father wasn't exposed, all of the normal stuff that we get. To think that our officials were actually saying, actually, that fallout has travelled 4,000 kilometres across the world on the wind, and potentially could have affected Steve's dad, because it landed in the sand and was blown around, as we say. That he could have perhaps inhaled something that was fallout from a test that my father was stood watching, is for the first time connecting tests together, things that were happening at the same time. But it also goes on further, talking about the hazards and the risks to human health in that report. We're talking about not just atmospheric fallout, we're talking about contaminated air, we're talking about water contamination, we're talking about particulate matter that is moving because of the result of an explosion. And the explosion they go to on May the 3rd in that document is not even the biggest Dominic explosion. So it makes you wonder what the 7.7 megaton explosion did across the world, and looking at the patterns across the world. And that's the key thing for me, is this correlation between the two things that were happening at the same time, how they were affecting each other. And it's really the worldwide picture. We've always spoken about the worldwide fallout from nuclear disasters and other things. There's always been lots of speculation about the worldwide fallout from nuclear explosions, and that's the reason why the moratorium on atmospheric testing was taking place, because of the strontium-90 levels that were raising up. But we've never done any real detail into, actually, an explosion on Christmas Island was affecting guys that were doing weapons testing in Maralinga. That's never been done. So to see it here is really eye-opening, really, really eye-opening.
So the document says that radiation is spotted in the Australian Outback, and they think they can trace this radiation back to a weapons test in part of Operation Dominic, a weapons test codenamed Arkansas, which was a 1.1 megaton bomb dropped from a parachute near Christmas Island, in order to sort of test weapons development, basically. But the thing, as I understand it, is that they have always, the governments, the nuclear powers have always suggested that when you did these air bursts, they were so high and so powerful that the radiation that was produced as a result would have just sort of drifted away on stratospheric winds around the world, would have been dispersed fairly globally, would have, fallen in such a way, or contaminated things in such a way that it was so minor by the time it had all kind of diluted around the globe that it didn't really make any difference to things. And I suspect, Steve, that what they found at Maralinga is only because they happened to be looking at Maralinga because they were doing their own weapons testing there. So they happened to have the health physics stuff on site. They were doing these health physics checks, and on whoopsie-daisy, we found this stuff which has fallen. Now, what we don't know, I suppose, maybe a physicist could tell us, is whether the stuff that's fallen here is stuff that was on those really high stratospheric winds and just happens to have descended everywhere, and they happen to have found it in Maralinga, or if it was stuff that was lower down, that was coming across the ocean on lower winds, and this was where the fallout plume was headed, and so you got the heaviest possible doses towards Australia. But presumably that means, anyway, that a lot of Australia would have had quite a lot of stuff blown all over it.
I think you could argue even further than that. I mean, if it was detectable, then clearly it's not the sort of stuff you want to breathe in or ingest. And it doesn't go in a straight line, a very narrow straight line. It disperses. So there were many, many other explosions, as Alan said, apart from the one on May 3rd. So what if the wind was going in a different direction? Where did this radiation fallout travel to? Because you could argue, everybody in Australia that's between Christmas Island and Maralinga on probably quite a wide path, it could have dropped on them, and it probably did. And different explosion, different wind, it blows across another country, and so you're talking about global pollution on a much bigger scale than they said. And for me, the shocking thing is that they have all this data. They've always had this data, and then often they'll turn around and say, well, there was no harm. But the data's there. It shows amazing. That it's there.
It's amazing, isn't it, that they can say that your dad wasn't harmed by the radiation that he was right next to that was British. But yet, at the same time, they were recording radiation that had come from a long way away that was American, which the physicists at the time clearly think was worth noticing. In fact, there was enough of it to count, which would imply there's enough of it to start worrying about. Now, the one thing I want to ask, Alan, is that I know that your work with Lab Rats, you do a lot of stuff with veterans of Operation Dominic who are able to request war pensions from the Americans, because Dominic was an American series of tests using some British troops at a British base. And so the troops like your dad that were there are denied a war pension by the British, who say there was no harm done, but can get a war pension from the Americans for a range of certain illnesses. But what does that is known as the RECA program? What would that do if we now know that radiation from Dominic was blowing across all of Australia, or at least as far as Maralinga, if not any further? Doesn't that mean a huge increase in the bill and the potential claimants? Because anybody who's got a radiogenic cancer, one of those 20 which are recognised under the RECA program, anyone who's got those in Australia would previously have been trying to get a war pension out of the British for it, thinking it was a British weapon that had caused their cancer. But now it might be the Americans, and they've already got a war pension system. So, I mean, why aren't we all busy applying to the Americans for a war pension? It's going to put the bill up by billions, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they have a two classification. So you're either what they call an on-site participant, like my father was an on-site participant, but they do have downwinder categories as well. So people in the States near Nevada were downwinders from the tests. So you could argue that Steve's dad is a downwinder of an Operation Dominic test and fits into the downwinder category because there's evidence that shows that there was potential hazard. So if Steve's dad would have got one of the 20 cancers, could you argue it? I mean, it's not part of their program at the moment, but why not? Why couldn't it be? And if it does become part of the program and could be argued, then you've got to look at all the tests globally. And that's what the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is trying to do, to have a global fund which is for the victims of nuclear testing, because they appreciate that there are so many victims worldwide of nuclear testing, and it's probably a topic for another podcast, but that they want to talk about it. They want to say that there are victims everywhere. But now we've added in the next variable. The variable is it's not just your own test that you were participating in. It's now potentially another test that was happening at the same time or around the same time that you've been affected by. It does blow apart the structures of the different countries, and it blows apart the MOD's reasoning for not introducing a RECA program that says, well, the American tests were nothing to do with us. That's the Americans. If you've got a problem with an American test, you need to talk to America. Well, this is an American test affecting a British personnel in Maralinga. Now they've got to join the dots and put the two together.
Jon, where does all this sit with the different nuclear powers and their wish to keep all their weapons tests separate at the time, and their subsequent dealings with the consequences of that separate as well. And the fact that our government locked up this document behind the highest of national security, and it would appear to be something that is protecting the Americans that we've locked up, because they would face a really big bill for this if it ever got to have any kind of sort of legal bearing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was looking at the language within the document as well. So just to read out for 1 second, it would appear that the early fallout at Maralinga may possibly be related to the megaton explosion. So sometimes when you look at what we're finding in Merlin, the language is often very non-committal. So although a lot of these reports want to be authoritative, they want to say, this is the truth, this is the science. Very often when you read through, there is that sort of degree of, actually, we're not quite sure. So I think that uncertainty often sort of pervades. I think it seems to pervade how these officials were thinking about radiation fallout. They were, you can't. It took 22 days. It says in the report for the fallout to reach Maralinga from from Dominic, so from Christmas Island. So 22 days. I mean, do they know what's going on within that 22 days? And the fact that they're building in this wriggle room when
they write the initial report at the time in the 50s. I mean, in the discussion of the document, it says this fallout has been identified as fission products produced early in May. And I suppose you can figure that out because once you know the half-life, the rate at which the radiation decays, you can calculate back to the point at which it must have gone bang, and therefore it's early May-ish. And then it says, and must therefore represent a part of the United States operation Dominic conducts at Christmas Island. But there are other people setting off weapons around the same time. I think the Americans would argue that, well, look, if you found radiation at Maralinga, then it's British radiation, mate, wherever you think it's come from, because you were blowing stuff up around then. How do you know that it wasn't this stuff? And they might argue that this is the British trying to, in the same way they wrote the early part of the document to say, well, it's maybe. By the time they get to the end and it's firmed up a bit, they're covering their own arses and saying it's definitely not British radiation that's hurting our guys who are here in the middle of the outback without any protection. It's definitely the Americans. I mean, it could even be argued that it is, it's another attempt to pretend it's not the British radiation that's a problem.
Yeah, correct. I was going to ask Steve, actually. So here there seems to be evidence that scientists knew that there was this fallout there at the time. So how does this make you feel in terms of, the lack of research there's been into, the potential genetic effects of radiation exposure?
I think it's shameful, isn't it? Because we do need the research. There's not really been any meaningful research done. I mean, for the amount of people affected, why isn't there the interest in doing the research? And, begs the question, is that because they're frightened of the outcome and litigation? But it's got to be done for the people involved. I mean, there's so many unanswered questions, are all of my conditions use my dad's service, or some of them? Are any of them treatable? Don't know. And what about the future for my children? I mean, one of the things that, the cycle has to end is this cycle of trauma and fear around having children. Because when my wife was pregnant, it should be a joyous occasion, but it was almost tainted by this fear that, what, are my children going to be born disabled? There's a higher risk. There's a definite higher risk. And that's the sort of stuff that keeps you awake at night. And when you're at the scans, you're sort of bugging the radiographer, sort of, is everything okay? You sure everything's okay? Are the limbs the right length? Asking all these questions, and it's a stressful time. And then, obviously, my first son has this genetic condition with his teeth. And for me, the first thing I think of, well, what's next? Because so few of us have one condition. Most have many, many conditions. you're thinking, what is next? And a lot of them do come out in adolescence. So what's his future? And then my 10-week-old, he's fine at the moment, but what's his future? What I worry. I just worry. I can't help it. And I know every parent worries about the children, but I must come across almost paranoid, and maybe I am, but maybe with good reason. But that is why we need research. I mean, I think my medical records are flagged. I'm pretty sure a lot of veteran ones are flagged by the government as well. So does it beg the question, is there research being done on our medical records without our knowledge? I just don't know. But there needs to be publicly accessible research, which then informs how the NHS is gearing up to deal with the sort of radiogenic illnesses that we have, because it's just not prepared at the moment. And I want my kids to look back and say, well, yes, I was able to go to the doctor and he knew all about. It set off a process. They checked me out and I'm fine, but that's thanks to the work by lab rats. I just think it's got to happen, this research.
I suppose, Alan, I mean, there's the possibility that what we do know about the way that the Americans and the British worked together after cooperation was restored by our H-bomb program is that when there is top secret research going on, science of any sort, they don't publish it widely. They don't go and stick it in the main academic journals. They act as each other's peer reviewer, right? They share it with each other and check each other's work, and perhaps with a few other allies as well. And so there is analysis and defense research going on that is unpublished, that we don't know. And one of the things that I've sort of come to understand about Merlin and the documents and the program that was going on at the time is that lots of other countries were doing, who had nuclear weapons tests, were doing some kind of human experiment at the same time, in different ways. I mean, the Americans were making people watch the weapon and, like you said, march towards the bomb. I think the Chinese were making people ride on horseback through fallout and stuff to see what happened, simulating charges and stuff like that. But the British appear to be the only country that just didn't do anything, unless this program of medical monitoring on men like your dad's is something that they did collate the evidence for, and they did study any children.
Yeah, I think there's more to come. There's definitely more to come that we don't know about. I mean, Merlin is a great source of information for us that's already filling in gaps that we didn't know about, like this one particular document we're talking about now. And there's so much that's become available that we've never seen. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time, and we've never seen descendants usually doing it an awful long time. And these are new documents with new revelations, which then lead you on to another document and another document and another document, which leads you down a completely different path that you didn't know about to start with, that leads you onto a secret group of people who've been meeting in secret that we didn't know about, a subsection and a subcommittee and other people that met about other things, not just in the UK, but collaborating worldwide on stuff. And I think we have to realise that almost everybody involved in the testing program was part of an experiment. When you read documentation from people like William Penny that says the explosion could be plus or minus 20 to 40%, don't really know until we set it off. That's what we were. We were experimenting with people. Yeah, the whole point of the guys being there was how quickly can you get up? How quickly can the infrastructure restore itself? How quickly can the ships react? How quickly can the tanks react? How quickly can we get a fighting force back out there if something was to happen? And that was at a cost a lot to the indigenous people. We just took over their lands, destroyed them, pushed them to one side, sacred lands that they've had for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands and thousands of years, and just literally pushed them to one side. So there's lots of questions that still need to be answered, lots of health impacts that need to be answered. But the evidence that we're uncovering in this project with Merlin is making great steps in that, because it's It's giving us a better understanding of what they were thinking in the 1950s. And that's the key thing. You look at some of the language that's used in the 50s that Jon spoke about earlier. Some of it's very derogatory to Indigenous people as well. Some of it is very dismissive of the servicemen, the scientists. And it was an experimental program. Let's be honest, it was an experimental program. We did not know what it was going to do. And as it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the tests got more and more and more invasive, and more real scientific experiments that they were doing, what happens to beryllium? What happens to plutonium? What Steve's dad was doing ended up being the most polluting experiments that the planet's ever seen. We know that now through this documentation, and we know that not only was that there, it was contaminated from stuff at Dominic as well. So we have to then realise that we are talking of a worldwide issue. We're not just talking about British nuclear testing, we're talking about nuclear testing on the planet. And that's where we need to be. We need to be understanding that they were experimentation for the global arms race. And we need to understand that people got harmed during that process and are still continuing to be harmed today because of it.
Jon, if there was, and it's a big if because we don't have this, if there were any fallout studies being done by governments, why would they have needed to do it? Can you explain it from the point of view of a Cold War politician or physicist who would go, well, this is a damn good idea. Let's go and put some young lads in the way of some plutonium.
I mean, I feel like I'm speculating with any answer, but I suppose it would be to find out what happens to the material when it ends up, wherever it ends up. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? We are finding through Merlin and also through the whistleblower report, Susie, that the government knew more than they've ever said. So something like the Clare report from 1993, which was supposedly an authoritative report about levels of contamination, we know now to be misleading. That would probably be a sort of moderate way to.
That's a whole other podcast, I think, that one on the Clare report and the whistleblower who's come forward recently. The stated position of government and the stuff we're finding on Merlin, and I suppose what I'm trying to get at for our listener is, why would the government lie about that? Because it was trying to keep us at home safe from a nuclear attack. It was trying to get these weapons. Perhaps it was doing some kind of analysis on the men that were there to find out, what would happen to people here in Britain if we were subject to a nuclear attack. I think most veterans I've spoken to over the years have said, well, that would be reasonable to take those records. It's why you didn't then say that you had them, why you took things out of medical records, why you would try to keep it secret that you did it when it seems so obvious.
I find it incredible, Susie, that we're even still at the level where I have a document from the UK government that says my father got less background radiation at Christmas Island than he would have done if he'd have stayed at home.
Well, that's because it all blew to Australia. That's
but that's true if you went to Christmas Island without 24 detonations of a nuclear weapon. Yeah, that's the level that we're at with it. And yeah, that's fine. But he stood there and witnessed 24 detonations. Yeah, it's just unbelievable the level that we're at. And this is what Merlin is bringing out now. That not only did the call it a cover-up, call whatever you need to be, the hiding of these documents, is that they knew. That's the big thing. They knew that this was happening. They knew that it was being affected. They knew that, especially, take this document we'll talk about today, they knew that fallout had travelled 4,000 kilometres across the world in 22 days. So if they knew that at the time, why are they not now looking back at other tests and going, well, hang on a moment, we did a 3.3 megaton explosion on Christmas Island. Where did that go? I can't believe that they didn't go, where did that go? Because they must know where it went. Why was there a test ban treaty in 1963 if that data was not available. It must have been available.
If they knew, then they must have known, because otherwise, why didn't they do some of these experiments in the Cotswolds? They did it as far away from Westminster as they possibly could, because they knew how damn dangerous it was.
Yeah, there is nowhere you could go further away from Whitehall. Okay, Christmas Island, which is now known as well, it's still pronounced Christmas, but it's Kiritimati if you want to write it out in English lettering, but it's still pronounced Christmas. Part of the Kiribati Republic. It's on, literally, if you had a globe in your hands, dear listener, and you had your one finger on Whitehall, and you put the other finger on Kiribati, they are on diametrically opposite bits of the globe. You can't get further away from Whitehall without coming back towards Whitehall. So that's where it was. Of course, Maralinga was incredibly remote, and both these places were somewhere that veterans were not able to run away from if they wished to do so. And of course, had they done so, they would have probably been shot or court-martialed or something. So you've both clearly got many years of questions yet to be answered. I think just while we're wrapping up, what, from both of your points of view, what would you need? What do you want to come out of this project at Liverpool? And what does it mean that you've got this, group of students and a body like the Centre for People's Justice that is trying to get to the bottom of some of this for you?
I mean, the project is fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic, because the analysis that's being done of the documents, when you look at some of the documents and the classification given to them by the AWRE and the metadata, the classification is completely wrong. But to get a new look at these documents, some of the documents we're seeing for the first time, the students are picking up information and going, I've seen this person before. That references this document. What's this? What's that in this document? We can answer certain questions, but they're delving really deep into the documentation and looking at the meanings of these documents. We can sometimes, because we've been involved for so many, go, oh, that's an Operation Buffalo document, or and not look at the detail. Because it's new to them, they are really researching it. And that's the key thing for us. It's not us looking at it, skipping over it. They're looking at every single line and every single word. And that's the really key thing for me, is that they are really doing it in detail.
I think for me, it's about access to the truth. We've never had this ability to dive as deep as we have into such a large amount of documents, and it's something we could not have done without the university and the Centre for People's Justice. So, it's a massive thanks from me, and I'm sure everyone at LabRats that has just given us this unprecedented access to the truth, really.
And one of the big things for us, Susie, as well, is time. The veterans don't have time on their side. They've definitely not got time on their side. If you and I were to look through 28,000 documents, how long are we going to be sat here for? But the students looking through and diluting it into the number of students that we have, with their academic minds looking at it, it speeds up the process. It's very easy for the government to give you a massive data dump and there you go, you asked for it, there it is. Whereas this gives us a lot more of a decent time frame to actually do the correct analysis on those.
Yeah, it's almost another offence, isn't it, John, that the government just published nearly 1 million pages of stuff for the veterans and said, there you go, pick the sweet corn out of that.
Yeah, it's very it's been very challenging, hasn't it? I feel like we've learned a lot as a team to try to unravel some of the ways that these files have been catalogued. Some on through the National Archive website have a lot of keywords attached, some don't. For example, some are really long files, some are really short. So it's certainly been challenging, but hopefully our project is going some way, as Steve said, to improve the access to all that information and gradually find out what the most significant pieces of information are. Because very often we're finding things just kind of buried in long documents and this kind of thing. So I think the human eye and the brain is still showing itself to be the best way to really understand what's within the Merlin database.
Yeah, and a journalist looking at it with a historian, and with the students as well, is looking at different things and different aspects of it and informing each other as we go, because it's great to have your input in it, because I don't know some of this stuff, and I think probably from your point of view, the stuff I bring to it is something new and different and exciting and sweary, and something
Well,
else for you to get.
Well, Susie, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of this history, so it's been really good.
Encyclopedic swears as well. But I think we're a bit out of time. There's still 28,000 files to go, of course, dear listeners, so stick with us. Thank you, Alan and Steve, for coming on and talking about these issues. Next week, our guest is going to be Dr. Chris Hill from the University of South Wales, and another one of our students, I think.
Yeah, and we're looking at a document that a student found. It's quite near the start of our project, all about the Tsar bomber, the largest ever nuclear detonation at 50 megatons that was detonated in 1961, and how the UK kind of responded to that in a way that we hadn't really heard about before. So, I hope you can join us next time. Thanks once more to Steve, to Alan, to Susie, and we'll hope to see you next time.
This podcast series is part of the Nuclear Justice Research Project based at the University of Liverpool. Funded by Research England's Policy Fund, the project is a collaboration between the Centre for People's Justice and the Department of History, investigative reporter Susie Boniface, and LabRats International. All historic images are Crown copyright and reproduced under the Open Government Licence. With thanks to Dr. Jonathan Hogg, Susie Boniface, Sarah Jane Stroud, Michael Bayliss, and the team of students.